The first three are Mike Turner, Riccardo Tarno, and Karl Lammers. So the floor is to Mike Turner, former President of the Assembly, my predecessor, and the head of the U.S. delegation. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your great address, and thank you for your commitment to a strong relationship between NATO and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I know our President will be speaking before your summit, and I appreciate that you continue to have a strong role for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in NATO and NATO debates. You gave us a pretty aggressive agenda. Your fifth item, burden sharing, I know is going to be a significant topic for you at the summit. Certainly President Trump has made that a big issue. I was hoping that you might be able to help us, because as a body, we have a debate on this issue as to what was the commitment in Wales. As you know, and you just described, the European Deterrence Initiative, which is funded by the United States, which began as a European reassurance initiative by the United States, was undertaken with an expectation of sort of an American reassurance initiative, and that is the commitment in Wales. And when we have our debates here, trying to discuss the 2%, some people believe it's a pledge, some people believe it's a commitment, some people believe it's a goal, some people believe it's an aspiration, some people believe it's a suggestion, that perhaps it just should be should. Some people think it may be just imaginary. I know the American taxpayer certainly is very concerned about this. On our House floor, repeatedly, we are challenged as members who are pro-NATO as to why the American taxpayer would continue to be receiving the bill for the defense of Europe, when obviously Europe's economy can sustain its own defense and we could work more cooperatively. Help us understand what is the 2% and what should we be looking towards as we debate that issue. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you, Mike. Now, Riccardo Tarno, the head of the Spanish delegation. Ricardo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will speak in Spanish. El Secretario General
The Secretary General has spoken to us about how our countries overcome our differences and problems, but now in Europe, essentially, there are certain political parties, populist political parties that are non-traditional, are gaining weight and clout in our parliaments, with the aim of demolishing multilateralism, sometimes bringing down the European Union, and bringing into question successful organizations and alliances such as NATO. They have their programs propose eliminating sanctions for Russia or withdrawing from Syria. So it's not a problem between countries anymore. It's inside our countries. There is part of the public opinion is very influenced from fake news, disinformation that come often from Russia. It can affect our electoral results, and once achieved, they're trying to destabilize our foreign policy, our immigration policy, and our defense policy within our countries. We're seeing how in more and more European countries, this type of electoral programs and parties are gaining greater and greater success. To what extent can this affect the future and within the alliance and treaty of the Northern Alliance?
President of the Assembly, head of the German delegation, and chairman of the working group on education in our Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Secretary General, first of all, thank you very much for your great speech and for your very impressive work and dedication to peace and stability worldwide in very turbulent times. I think we all agree to that what you say, that NATO and the EU must work closer together, strengthen their cooperation in order to defend us and defend our values against external threats. What is your view of PESCO, permanent structured cooperation? Where do you see the most tangible value added to NATO-EU cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First, to Mike Turner, thank you for your commitment, because I know that you have been president of this assembly, but I also know that what you do in Washington and in the Congress is of great importance for the whole alliance. So thank you for your commitment and for your strong support to our alliance in the United States. In addition to being part of this assembly. Then burden sharing. Well, you can all read the text, and the text in the Wales Declaration goes approximately like this: that all allies agree to stop the cuts, gradually increase defense spending as their economies grow, and then move towards spending 2% of GDP on defense within a decade. There is some more language, but that's the essence of the pledge. And then, of course, you can ask 10 lawyers to provide a legal interpretation of that document. And then you will have, I guess, 10 different interpretations. And then we can pay 10 more lawyers, even more, to provide you with a new interpretation. And that's the reason why I'm not a lawyer. Because, at least, because I'm a politician. Because this document is not a legal document. It is a political document with a political commitment. And there is no doubt that first of all, that there is no doubt that all allies should stop the cuts. And second, all allies should increase defense spending in real terms. And then there is a political expectation that allies should meet or spend 2% on defense. That's the political reality. But we didn't promise to do this within a year. We promised to do it within a decade. And as I said, we have a good start. Because 3 years or 3.5 years into the period, we have seen after years of decline that all allies have started to increase. Last year we had close to 5% real increase in defense spending in total across Europe and Canada. And we expect continued increase also in 2018, which means that we will have 4 consecutive years of real increase. So I think that the pledge has been, I should say, extremely important, and that it has really changed the way allies now are looking on defense investments, because they have turned the corner and start to move in the right direction. Then on Ricardo Tarno, yes, there are in many NATO allies, there are parties, you can call them populist parties, you can call them different things, they are different parties, which are often not in favor of multinational institutions. My impression, but you can correct me, is that they are often more critical towards the European Union than they are towards NATO. But again, that's for the different parties to define, and it may differ between different countries. My message is the same, is that in the long run, we can only be an alliance of 29 democracies if we are able to convince the people in our countries that this alliance is useful. There is no way NATO can fix, change the attitudes of people. People decide in a democracy. And the only way NATO can be strong is that we have the trust of the people in NATO allied countries, as the same case for the European Union. I'm not talking on behalf of the European Union, but I saw recently an opinion poll which shows that actually it's increased support for the European Union all over. When it comes to NATO, the opinion poll shows strong support. It varies a bit, but it is strong and it has increased. I think that one of the challenges we have is that we have to explain that it is in the interest of NATO allies and the people, the close to 1 billion people living in NATO allied countries, to have a strong NATO. And a strong NATO is good for Europe and good for the United States and Canada. 2 world wars and the Cold War taught us that we are stronger together than alone. And I think we have to remember that that we are, for instance, in Afghanistan or in Iraq, not only to help the people of Afghanistan and Iraq, but we are there because it is in our interest to fight terrorism in these countries. Because we have seen that if Afghanistan or Iraq or other countries become safe haven for international terrorists, then they will launch attacks against us. So we are there to protect us and to make our citizens more safe. Because sometimes I think that people in our countries, they believe that we send soldiers to Afghanistan or we spend money training Iraqi officers just to be nice to those countries. No, we are there also because it is in our interest to make sure that these countries are not launching pads or platforms for organizing terrorist attacks against ourselves. And it's also a way to address the migrant and refugee crisis. If our neighbors are more stable, there will also be less migrants and refugees being forced to flee their own countries. Then, Karl Lammers, it's great to see you again. You asked me about NATO, EU, and PESCO. Well, I'm in favor of PESCO because it has been so clearly stated that the purpose of PESCO is to develop European military capabilities. Drones, planes, different military formations and so on. And those capabilities are going to be developed based on that the EU's efforts should be complementary to NATO efforts, meaning that we need to have coherence between EU efforts and NATO efforts. We cannot end up in a situation where the European Union defines the list of capabilities and then NATO has another list and then they are conflicting. That will be impossible for especially those allies who are members both of the European Union and NATO at the same time. And that those capabilities, if it's a new plane or a new drone or whatever it is available, are available to also NATO missions and operations. This is important because we have to understand that even though I welcome stronger European or EU efforts on defense, the European Union can never replace or be an alternative to NATO for many reasons. Partly because of economy, also partly because of size. We have to remember that especially after Brexit, 80% of NATO's defense expenditure will come from non-EU allies. So meaning that most of our military capabilities will come from non-EU allies, meaning that non-EU allies will be essential for the security of also EU countries. It's partly about money, but also partly about geography. I think it's hard to imagine, or to say, a strong defense of Europe without in the north, countries like Norway and Iceland, not very big countries, but geographically important, located up in the north. In the south, Turkey, extremely important for all of us, bordering Iraq, Syria, and all the turmoil in the Middle East. And then in the west, US, Canada, and UK. So I welcome PESCO, but as something that is going to supplement and strengthen the European pillar within NATO, not developing something that will compete or be an alternative to NATO. Thank you. The next 3 speakers will be Philippe Folliot, Lord Joplin, and Miro Kovac. Philippe Folliot, the head of the French delegation.
Française. Thank you very much, Secretary General, President. First of all, in behalf of the French delegation, I want to tell you how much we appreciated your speech and the commitment, your commitment to the alliance, and just a few days ago, we received in Paris at our National Assembly, and there I think we received you there, and I think you saw that our commitment, our strong commitment to the alliance. My question will concern the problem of rare earth elements and the strategic independence of the members of the alliance. These elements, well, there are 17 chemical elements which are essential because they're unavoidable for producing certain digital items, our smartphones and other items. The progress and the presence of these new technologies make it possible to estimate a constant increase of 4% in terms of the demand of these elements until 2022. Today, China concentrates between 80 and 98% of the production of these elements. This situation is supported by reports by the United States Geological Survey, a scientific agency in the United States, and by the European Commission. They have clearly indicated in a communication of November 15, 2017, that China, and this is a quote, China is the country that has the most influence as regards the world supply of these these elements. The access to these elements also is an important security challenge for the countries of the alliance. If there's an interruption in the supply of these elements, it could be disastrous for economies and our armed forces. So could you, Secretary General, indicate to what extent the alliance is aware of the question of access to these elements, which really raises some important questions concerning our strategic independence? Thank you.
Lord Jopling, our former Vice President from the United Kingdom. Michael.
First of all, I'm most grateful to the leader of the British delegation for allowing me to come in. Secretary General, you started your address by talking about the importance of parliamentary oversight. And I want to draw your attention to concerns which some of us have at the internal management of NATO. Thanks to the work of the previous Assembly, President Hugh Bailey, we now have access to the reports of the International Board of Auditors for NATO. And the recent unclassified report gives rise to what I believe are most serious concerns. I quote to you just 4 of them. First of all, there is no common internal control network. Second, recurrent and persistent weaknesses in the current internal control systems in most entities. Third, difficulties in accepting and developing the identification and accounting of tangible and intangible assets like property, plants, and equipment. And finally, and perhaps more seriously, lack of support and even opposition to both internally and externally to study the financial consolidation and the creation of a chief finance officer. Secretary General, these are devastating criticisms. And quite honestly, if criticism of this nature had been directed at a publicly quoted company, heads would roll. I'm sure in your response you will tell us that you are responding to these reservations, but the real question is how have we got into this situation, which is most alarming, and should not this be the 6th topic for the NATO summit in Brussels?
Thank you. My good friend Miro Kovac from Croatia, he speaks excellent Italian, so...
Grazie a lei, Presidente. Dear Secretary General, in Croatia, we appreciate very much NATO's and your personal engagement in the Western Balkans, which is a neighboring region of Croatia, and also the engagement of the President of the Assembly, Mr. Paolo Alli. You mentioned also the influence of third countries in the Western Balkans. You recently also visited the Western Balkans. I would like to ask you about your evaluation of the prospects for Bosnia and Herzegovina to join the membership action plan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. First, to France.
Well, we are aware of that technology, equipment is essential for any military force or defense, and therefore one of the issues we have been very strongly focused on over the last years, especially since the Warsaw Summit, is what we call resilience. And that is the importance of having both military but also civilian infrastructure, equipment, which is strong and which is not vulnerable to potential adversaries. So part of our focus on resilience is also how to, for instance, work together with industry, and that's very much the case, for instance, when you speak about cyber, on making sure that our armed forces get the support, the technology, and all the different products they need to be able to always provide credible deterrence and defense for NATO, also in times with also increasing need for advanced types of equipment with a lot of elements from different nations. Then to Lord Jopling. Well, also, first of all, in one way, we don't need a sixth issue for the summit to address transparency, because one of the topics is what I called alliance modernization, and that's partly about the command structure, but it's also partly about reforming the headquarters. So we have something ongoing now which we call a functional review, which is to make sure that the headquarters is working as good as possible, which includes also the need to be transparent and to have good quality when it comes to IBAN and financial oversight and all that. So to the extent there is a need to do changes or to implement changes, that can be addressed under the, I think it was the fourth main item or issue, alliance modernization, which is not only about the command structure, but also about how to make sure that the headquarters is working in the best possible way. Second, we have already done a lot to make sure that we have good economic oversight, that we have transparency, and that numbers and figures are available. And all nations, all the 29 allies, have access to all the facts and figures and numbers. So one possibility is actually to ask your government to provide you with facts and numbers if you want more details about also how we spend and financial management in NATO, because we are transparent to the nations. They are present in Brussels, and they can share with you facts and figures which they get access to in NATO. But of course, we can always be better, and therefore part of the functional review or the modernization reform of the headquarters can also address any potential improvements in the way we do financial oversight. Then the Western Balkans. So NATO has a history in the Western Balkans. We have a presence in the Western Balkans. We have many members there. The latest member is Montenegro, and we have partners. Bosnia-Herzegovina, well, we support the reform efforts. We support the efforts for Bosnia-Herzegovina to move towards membership, but we have clear conditions. We have what we call the Tallinn conditions, which requires that Bosnia-Herzegovina should be able to register all immovable defense property. This may sound like a bit like a bureaucratic requirement, but it's actually about whether the state has full control over the armed forces, which is then reflected by or which is reflected by to which extent it is able to register all the defense properties. So they have made progress also on that, but there are still some challenges, and allies are addressing them together with Bosnia-Herzegovina.
And I know that as we prepare for the summit, the question of whether to activate the membership action plan for Bosnia and Herzegovina will be one of the main issues, and it's a bit too early for me to tell you exactly what will be the outcome of the ongoing process when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you. The next three speakers will be Carlos Costa Neves, Ausrine Armonaite, Irakli Beraya. Carlos, the head of the Portuguese delegation, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary General, also for your excellent introduction, but mainly and of course for the quality of your work to the Alliance. Dear colleagues, speaking of the southern flank of our alliance, we have to admit the enormous geopolitical challenge it also represents. I refer naturally to Afghanistan and the vast area of the MENA countries, which naturally includes the Middle East and all of the North Africa. But I would say beyond. In fact, according to the expressive report, Instability in the South, presented last Saturday in one of our meetings, and I quote, "Division between North Africa and Sahel is obsolete." Don't you think, Mr. Secretary General, that we have to go beyond, not to say deeper? In this context, what role and what capabilities for the Alliance South Hub located in Naples? I'm quite interested in your reflections on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. I also add my personal question for support the question of Carlos regarding the hub. Ausrine Armonaite from Lithuania.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear Secretary General. First of all, thank you very much for your speech and for this comprehensive presentation and your efforts making NATO stronger. My question is regarding energy. So energy is not only a phenomena of economics, but also more and more a case of defense and security. So first of all, as a control of the resources gets smarter, systems may become vulnerable for cyber attacks. And second, critical infrastructure may be used to place listening and monitoring technology used by foreign intelligence. And for instance, these concerns were raised regarding Nord Stream 2 project in the Baltic Sea. So what is your view regarding these energy security challenges and what NATO could do, well, in helping its members to combat these threats? Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. Irakli Beraya, the acting head of the Georgian delegation, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Secretary General, for your great address. I would like to express my sincere appreciation for your support to Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration process. And as we all well know, NATO has underlined on numerous occasions that Georgia has registered significant progress and demonstrated performance expected from an aspirant nation. With its sizable contribution to NATO operations, Georgia has proved that it can be a valuable and effective security provider and take the responsibility of collective security. And against this background, what will be the deliverable of the upcoming Brussels summit with regards to Georgia, and what shall the Georgian people expect? Will the next summit take our country one step closer to our ultimate goal, which is NATO membership? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First, to the question. First of all, I promise to try to be a bit shorter in my answers because we have so many speakers on the list, so it has to be, what I say, a bit telegraphic style. When it comes to what more we can do in the MENA region, so first of all, we are doing a lot in the MENA region. We have many partners there. We are working closely with them. Second, I think that we have the potential to do much more. But to be able to do so, we need the full support from all 29 allies. And to be transparent with you, there are different views within the alliance among NATO allies to what extent NATO should do more. So the first condition for being able to do more is unity between all the 29 to step up. I think we have a potential to do more training, capacity building, as we have, for instance, do in Tunisia, but we can do more of that. And we have a DCP package for Jordan, and we're working on one for Tunisia. I think we can do more of that, also in other countries in the region. But to do so, we need then full agreement by 29 allies. Then to Lithuania, energy. Well, that's part of what we address in what we call the resilience pledge, or the resilience document we agreed, which provides guidelines for how to make sure that, for instance, critical infrastructure, and especially then energy infrastructure, is protected and safe. It's about sharing the best technologies, practices, and I know that Lithuania is playing a key role in doing exactly that. So we thank you for doing that for all NATO allies. And of course, it's also about diversification of energy supplies. And therefore, I think that what we see now with more investments in renewables is good for the climate, but it's also good for energy security, because that reduces dependency on imports. Energy diversification and reduced dependency on imports will also increase the resilience of our energy networks. Then on Georgia, well, first of all, we will continue to provide support to Georgia. Georgia has all the tools it needs to become a member of NATO, with the national annual plans, with the NATO Georgia Commission, and at the same time, membership action plan is an integral part of Georgia's membership process. We haven't decided all the elements and all the formats of the summit, but I am absolutely certain that allies will find a way at the summit in July to recognize the progress Georgia is making, and also to express our gratitude to Georgia for the very important and significant contribution Georgia is making to NATO operations and missions, being one of the biggest nations when it comes to providing troops, for instance, to our mission in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The next three will be Leona Aleslev, Ertan Aydin, and Andreas Loverdos. Leona Aleslev, the head of the Canadian delegation, which will host our next session in Halifax. Please, Leona.
Well, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. As a parliamentarian, you know how important it is to be able to communicate with our citizens, and our citizens support and advocate for things they understand. In my country, we had a survey that says that 70% of our youth, 70% of our women, and 64% of our entire population do not know what NATO is. If they don't know, they will not support us as parliamentarians in advocating for increased support, budgets, whatever, of NATO. So we also know that 70% of people today get their news from Facebook. How frightening that might be, it's a fact. So I'm wondering, we need help from NATO to be able to communicate with our citizens. We need content that we can then issue and magnify. We can be the force multiplier in our countries of that information, but we need the content to begin with from NATO. Do you envision a plan with clear objectives about enhancing communication and engagement from NATO? And will the organization be getting increased resources and personnel to be able to focus on that communication and engagement, particularly for our youth and particularly in that social media framework? Thank you.
Ertan Aydin from Turkey, please.
First of all, let me thank to your quality of presentation, Mr. Secretary General, that deal with serious topics in a comprehensive manner. Thank you. Actually, my question partly asked, and partly you have given the question, given the answer. But I think it is very important to underline it again. In recent years, we see a rising trend of populism and post-factual politics in all over the world. Unfortunately, the politicians of NATO member countries are not outside this misery. This trend paves the way for a deviation and withdrawal from the conventional democratic values, such as equality, freedom of expression, human rights, multilateralism, and the rule of law. For instance, in recent years, Trump administration pursues unilateral and populist policies in some very critical security topics, such as migration issues, climate issues, Palestinian question, and Iran nuclear deal. That seems a threatening element to the unity and ideals of the foundational principles of NATO. How is it possible to avoid from this political turmoil, and what can NATO do to prevent this populist, irresponsible tendency? And do you see this as a challenge to the cohesion, stability, and integrity to the NATO alliance? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Andreas Loverdos from Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Firstly, I would like to congratulate the Secretary General for his excellent address. And then I will make a comment on the illegal detention of 2 Greek soldiers by the Turkish authorities for 3 months now. On this issue, there are 2 important statements, declarations, resolutions coming from the European Parliament and from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This detention is completely illegal because it violates the human rights and the rule of law. Dear colleagues, actually, as the Greek delegation here, we don't want to propose you to adopt a relative resolution, but however, it could be critical if the Secretary General could make a relative comment. Thank you very much.
First to Leona Alesiv, thank you so much for the work you are doing in Canada, because we were together there for not so many weeks ago, and I know that you are doing a very important work there to make NATO more known. I will try, and NATO will try to help you and all other NATO allies as much as possible to provide information and to provide background and facts and figures about NATO. And we have also plans on how to step up our efforts to do exactly that. We have, as you know, a campaign now called We Are NATO, which is a campaign that we are developing in stages, and the aim of that campaign is to reach out to more people and to inform them about NATO. So we also have an excellent homepage or web page where you can get a lot of access. You can follow me on Twitter, then you get access to excellent statements I make all over the world and speeches, and you can read them loud if you want for your spouses, and then you can see how they react. So through social media and through the homepage of NATO, you can get access to a lot of information. So and we will strengthen, and we will do more, and we also have this We Are NATO campaign going on. But of course, we will try to help you, but you have to help us. Because at the end of the day, national politicians are much more closer to the people in their country than I will be. And I'm in Canada not so often, and of course it is the MPs, the members of parliament in Canada, they are the closest to inform the Canadian people of what NATO is and why NATO is important. So we have to help each other, and that's also one of the reasons why the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is so important, because then we can help and inspire each other by meeting as we do today. Turkey, Mr. Aydin. Well, so my main message is the same as I gave in my speech. Yes, there are serious disagreements. And I think it's important not to, in a way, try to deny that, because everyone sees it. Trade issues, Iran nuclear deal, and so on are serious issues. And of course, the best thing would be if we were able to solve those disagreements or those differences. And I think many allies, many friends of NATO are working on how to try to solve those issues. But then, as long as they are not solved, we have to make sure that we are able to deliver transatlantic unity. And the good thing is that that's exactly what NATO has been able to do, because they have, over the last couple of years, there have perhaps been more disagreements than we have seen before. But at the same time, over the last couple of years, we have seen European allies really stepping up, investing more in defense, and we have seen the US, not only in words, but also in deeds, stepping up their commitment to Europe. And that's the good news. So yes, there are concerns, but at the same time, NATO have proven once again that despite those differences, we deliver on NATO's core responsibility, collective defense, a strong transatlantic unity. Then on the situation for the Greek soldiers and the relationship between Greece and Turkey. So Greece and Turkey are two highly valued allies. And I appreciate very much the contributions of both Turkey and Greece to our shared security, to our collective defense. I visited both countries several times. There are some disagreements. I have discussed this both in Athens and in Ankara, and I continue to try to support all efforts to solve the disagreements or differences between two highly valued allies, Greece and Turkey. And I think if I was more into the details now, I think I would not help to solve those differences. Thank you.
Thank you. Next three will be Eva Kaili, Neil Friberson, and Bastian von Apeldoorn. Eva Kaili, the head of the delegation for the European Parliament. Please, Eva.
Thank you. Dear Secretary General, it was indeed an excellent speech. And thank you for your continuous efforts to enhance EU-NATO defense cooperation. Besides the increase of spendings for NATO that we usually address in these meetings, I would like to ask you what are the further steps you believe we need to take to enhance trust to our alliance? Coming from a country that actually fulfills its economic obligations, besides the severe economic crisis that we have faced, I believe building trust is essential between allies, since we face common hybrid threats, and we need to exchange sensitive information. It could be crucial not to be able to do that. What actions do you believe we should take to achieve equal respect to international law, but also between us? So, as my colleague mentioned several months ago, in northern Greece, Macedonia, where I'm from, at the EU-Turkey borders, indeed soldiers were arrested and without a fair trial. My father actually is a Turkish citizen. He has a second citizenship, a Greek born in Turkey. And he believes that it is extremely important to have the alliance of Turkey be able to work together and keep the stability that we have achieved in the region. But at the same time, we have constant violations of EU airspace and sea. And also the migration crisis among us requires constant diplomatic efforts to achieve common understanding. I do believe it's important and useful to enhance also our efforts for peace and make sure at least among allies there is increased trust. So what actions do you believe we can further take, since we are going to have you visiting Brussels very soon and trying to have an improved declaration for the further steps? Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Neil Friberson, the head of the delegation from Iceland, who invited me to visit Reykjavik next week. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, thank you, President, and thank you, Mr. General Secretary, for an excellent speech. I would like to start with, we talked about in the Education and Communication Working Group this weekend, and I want to emphasize what the head of the delegation from Canada was talking about, the importance of the people of the countries know what NATO is, just to empathize on that point. But I would like to address the important issue of gender equality and balance within NATO concerning that matter. The landmark resolution of United Nations Security Council 1325 on women, peace and security has brought an increased attention on gender equality and the importance of mainstreaming gender in activities and policies related to security and defense. One of the objectives of 3025 resolution is to promote the fair representation of both men and women in defense institutions and peace processes where parliaments and governments are key players. Therefore, we must aim at equal representation of both men and women in all our work, also within NATO. Concerning also your excellent speech before, when you were talking about the strength of NATO concerning adapt and unite. This is a part of the adaptation of NATO, I think. Do you see increased emphasis on issues relating to gender equality and following up on Security Council Resolution 1325 in NATO's work? Thank you.
Thank you. Bastiaan van Apeldoorn from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, we will later this morning discuss the NATO PA draft resolution in which it is proposed to reiterate support for the perspective for NATO membership for Georgia and the aspiration of Ukraine. In this context, I would like to invite you, Mr. Secretary General, to reflect upon remarks made by your predecessor, Mr. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer. De Hoop Scheffer, in an interview with Dutch media earlier this year, said it was a mistake to promise NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia. The former Secretary General argued that this unnecessarily radicalized Russia and made it pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. He also added that he had underestimated the Russian reaction in this regard, but that he could understand this reaction. In other words, it was a counterproductive move. Now, I think it is remarkable that the admission of this mistake came from a former Secretary General of NATO. And I wonder to what extent you, Mr. Secretary General, agree with your predecessor, and if not, why not? Some people argue that we cannot come back to the words of 2008, but surely also NATO can learn from its mistakes, and at least not go on repeating a promise that it should never have made, and that will only bring us further down the dangerous path of further escalation and confrontation with Russia, standing in the way of necessary dialogue and de-escalation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. First to Eva Kaili. What can we do to enhance the trust in the alliance? I think we can do many things. First, we should be very proud of what NATO is and how NATO has been able to respond and adapt. I am actually quite impressed by the fact that since 2014, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. We are delivering both in the fight against terrorism, we are delivering deterrence and defense in Europe, and we are seeing that more and more allies are contributing more, both when it comes to defense investments, but also, for instance, in the fight against terrorism. So NATO has proven to be very agile and able to adapt to change when the world is changing, so we should be proud of what we have achieved so far. Second, we should, and that was related to also the question from Canada, is that we should be even more focused on to share these facts with our public. So everything we can do to reach out to people will be of great benefit for NATO, and there we have to work together, national politicians with NATO as an alliance and me as Secretary General. Then I strongly believe that we need to meet and talk when there are differences. Again, I am aware of the differences between two highly valued NATO allies, Turkey and Greece. I am confident that Greece and Turkey will be able to discuss and address these differences in a spirit of mutual trust and allied solidarity. And I welcome the fact that both the Greek Prime Minister and the Prime Minister of Turkey have agreed to resolve the differences through dialogue. And as I said, I am also talking with them when I meet them, addressing these issues. You mentioned migration. Well, migration is an excellent example of why NATO has to work together with NATO allies like Greece and Turkey. NATO's presence in the Aegean Sea has been important to make sure to implement the agreement between the European Union and Turkey on the handling of the migrant and refugee crisis and the high number of illegal crossings we saw over the Aegean not so many years ago. So NATO has been important partly with our presence in the Aegean Sea, but also NATO presence have been a platform for strengthening the dialogue between a non-EU member, but a NATO member, Turkey, and the European Union. So NATO is important also when it comes to, for instance, managing the migrant and refugee crisis. Then Fridbergsson or Iceland, women, peace and security, that's extremely important. I'm proud of the fact that NATO is focused on that. And we have to remember that gender issues are important for NATO for several reasons. Partly this is about protecting vulnerable people in conflict. We know that women very often are vulnerable in armed conflicts, and we have many, many examples of sexual violence being used in an armed conflict. And therefore, anything we can do when it comes to training, increased awareness, better reporting on sexual violence is extremely important, and NATO is operating in some countries where we have seen that this has been a challenge, and therefore I'm proud that, for instance, when it comes to training of our soldiers prior to deployment, we are focused on gender issues. But gender issue is not only about protecting vulnerable women in armed conflict, but it's also about strengthening NATO. Because more women in our armed forces, more women in our leadership, both military and civilian, it's good for NATO. Of course, it's obvious that if you only recruit from one half of the population, the male population, you get less qualified people. You don't get the same quality as when you recruit from the whole population. So we have seen in more and more countries that women are now contributing more to the armed forces, which is extremely important for the quality of the armed forces. And then the Netherlands, von Apeldoorn. Well, I haven't seen exactly what my predecessor have said, so I'm a bit careful about commenting directly on what he has said, but I can comment on the issue, namely the question of Ukraine. First of all, I think we have to remember that the most important message is the following. That the whole idea that we should not be in favor of enlargement of NATO because Russia doesn't like it is a very dangerous approach. Yeah. Because it's possible to have different views on enlargement, because you can mean that the country has not reached the standards, has not modernized its armed forces, still struggle with corruption, so they don't qualify to become a member. That's fair. That's possible. And then there can be different views on that. But to say that the country which qualifies, which meets the standards to become a NATO member, should not join because Russia don't like it. I mean, I'm coming from a small country bordering Russia, and they didn't like it when we joined NATO. So if back in 1949, Washington and London and Paris have asked Moscow, do you like whether Norway is going to join? They have said no. Well, should Norway then have stayed outside NATO? No. So the thing is that this is really, you know, touching some of the most fundamental rights of every nation. And that is the sovereign rights of every nation to decide its own path. The whole idea that big nations have kind of say about what neighbors can do is bringing us back to the world order where big nations decided what small neighbors could do or not do. The sphere of influence. And that's the world we don't want. So neighbors of Russia have the right to do what they want to do, regardless of what Russia thinks about it. Yeah. And I say this also because the whole idea that this kind of provocation that the Baltic countries, Poland has joined NATO, no, it's not a provocation. It's a decision by sovereign nations through democratic processes that they wanted to become members of NATO. I accept that. But of course, Sweden and Finland, they are also close neighbors of Russia, or at least Finland and Sweden is almost. They have decided not to become members of NATO. I respect that too. But so, yeah, I will finish in a moment. But the thing is that whether a country is going to become a member of NATO or not is up to that country and the 29 allies to decide. No one else has a say, because we can never give any other country kind of veto to decide over other countries. That would be to reintroduce sphere of influence, and that's exactly what we're against.
Thank you. That's very important. And if I may comment just a few words. I was in Belgrade some weeks ago, invited by the parliament, and I spoke at a conference together with this Russian ambassador, Mr. Kislyak, very experienced. And I told him, well, you call for self-determination of people to justify the annexation of Crimea to Russia. And what about Georgia and Ukraine? You are occupying their territories. And he said, we are not occupying their territories. Those are independent countries, not provinces of Georgia. So this is the narrative of Russia, but we fully agree with you, with your remarks on Georgia and Ukraine. So the next three will be Franco Panizza, Corion Apetian, and Irina Fritz. Franco Panizza from Italy.
I prefer to speak in Italian. Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President Ali, for your very authoritative commitment. Thank you, Secretary General, for your very clear analysis, but particularly for having outlined positive development prospects for NATO, particularly in terms of efficacy and operational capability. I'd like to come to my question. We said that NATO is a community based on shared common values. The threats which we have to face today, from instability on the southern shore, the Mediterranean, which we've talked about, and the terrorist threat, together with the growth of global ambitions of China, particularly in Africa, call on all of us to strengthen the common commitment for security of our citizens. International missions are the highest example of cooperation, coordination, and responsibility sharing in NATO. And therefore, when we speak of burden sharing, commitments in international missions should be taken into account. These are missions which demonstrate a common commitment, whereas simply increasing expenditure might just mean an improvement of national forces without necessarily being in line with a common person. I'd like to ask your opinion on that.
The head of the Armenian delegation.
Thank you, Honorable President Ali. Your Excellency, Secretary General, today's session has coincided with historical event in my country. Armenia celebrates 100th anniversary of the First Republic, a date that symbolizes first expression of Armenian sovereignty and became turning point for our nation, for history of our nation and statehood. Please let me turn to my question. Armenia attaches high importance to partnership with NATO and has rich experience in peacekeeping in NATO operations. Armenia and European Union comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement envisage participation of my country in European Union-led civilian and military crisis management operations. We know that NATO and European Union closely cooperate in the field of peacekeeping in the Balkans and Afghanistan. In this regard, my question is following. Has NATO experience in assisting, preparing associate member states in participating in European Union-led operations? Thank you.
Thank you. Irina Frist, the head of the Ukrainian delegation.
Thank you. Secretary, taking this opportunity, I would like to ask a question. As you know, Hungary, as a NATO member state, has been blocking the NATO-Ukraine Commission meetings on all levels for the last 8 months. Because of this non-constructive position, 5 nuke meetings on different ministerial levels were blocked. And we are speaking about the meetings with the aspired country, who clearly declared the Euro-Atlantic integration as a national priority, and with the alliance neighbor, who at this moment suffered from the Russian aggression. Yesterday, we were told that before the end of this month, the next meeting of NATO-Russia Council will be held. What kind of message will this fact send to the world? Don't have the high-level meetings with Ukraine, but instead of this, to have the meeting with the aggressor, who annexed Crimea, continuing to kill people in Donbass and Syria, and shooting down aircraft with Europeans and their children, and could continue further. Last week, Hungary made one more, not only unfriendly, but unprecedented step, sending to you, Secretary General, and to all allies, the memorandum with the initiative to launch a new NATO policy on Ukraine. In this document, Ukraine was blamed in all possible sins, but all these sins can be forgiven only when Ukraine cancels its education law. This document ruins NATO's unity. We look at this document like the next steps to blackmail our country. We have almost implemented all proposals made by Venice Commission and are ready for the dialogue, but we would never accept the language of ultimatums. Can you please tell us what NATO plans to do with this memorandum? Is the alliance going to review its policy towards Ukraine, as Hungarian side insists? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First, to Mr. Franco Panizza. I agree that burden sharing is not only about spending, it's also about contributions to NATO missions and operations. And therefore, we have highlighted many times that this is about what we call the 3 Cs: cash, spending, capabilities, and contributions. But I think what we have seen is that in the long run, it is hard to get more out of less. So to be able to provide the necessary contributions, we also need more defense spending. So the way to understand what we agreed in Wales is not that we can choose between either capabilities or contributions or spending. We need to deliver on all 3 of them, so that's what we expect allies to do. But I agree, contributions are important, and I thank Italy for all the great contributions Italy is making to different NATO missions and operations, not least in Afghanistan, but also training activities, for instance, in Iraq. Then on Armenia, first of all, I would like to thank Armenia for providing troops and contributions, and also for the partnership we have with Armenia and the valuable contributions you are making to NATO missions and operations, for instance, in Afghanistan and in Kosovo. Then I would like to congratulate Armenia on a peaceful transition and the election of a new prime minister, and I look forward to working with the new prime minister and his administration. Yeah. Then I'm not, to be honest, NATO provide training and support, but I'm not aware of whether we have trained directly for EU missions and operations. But of course, as part of the partnership program, we provide training, capacity building in general, which I guess is also relevant for EU missions and operations. Then it was one more. That was Ukraine. First of all, actually today, later on today, this afternoon, there will be a NATO-Ukraine Commission meeting at ambassadorial level in Brussels. So we, of course, have close contact with Ukraine. We have a Commission meeting this afternoon, and I'm in regular contact with President Poroshenko and also Foreign Minister Klimkin and other Ukrainian officials. And Ukraine is a highly valued partner of NATO, and NATO will continue to provide, and we are continuing providing help, support to Ukraine. Then we are aware of the problems or the disagreements regarding the language law. I believe, and I've been talking both with Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and I've spoken with Petro Poroshenko, President of Ukraine, on this issue, and we are in close contact with them. Because, of course, we hope that it's possible to solve this disagreement as soon as possible. And I think that what we have to recognize is that it is important to reconcile the legitimate need and right of any minority to learn its own language, the minority language, but at the same time being able to learn the state language, because it is important also to be able to command the state language. And many other countries have been able to find ways to balance these needs, both to respect the minority language, but also learn the state language. And we hope that there is a way to also find a solution for this problem when it comes to the language law in Ukraine.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry to say that we will not have the chance to give the floor to everybody because we have still a long list. We take 6 more questions. Next 3, Richard Bennion, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, and Boris Vrachniewski. Richard, the head of the UK delegation.
Thank you, President. Secretary General, firstly, thank you for your robust comments following the Novichok attack in Salisbury. Your robust comments were echoed by a unanimous vote at our Standing Committee meeting in Vilnius, where every delegation of parliamentarians supported the response of the British government and called on all our allies to show a resolute response to Russia in the face of that evil act. 100 years ago saw the formation of the Royal Air Force. This was in response to technological advances that resulted in a new theatre of war. There are similarities today with cyber now the new battlefield. Clearly this demands a new doctrine backed, crucially, by structural reforms that address this new threat. Can you assure us that as part of the modernisation programme you've spoken about, NATO is deeply committed to addressing the cyber and the information warfare threat, and give examples of how these reforms will bring tangible change to our military posture at every level of the alliance?
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff from Germany.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. 2 questions briefly. One, the Iraq training mission. How and in which way do you believe the election result will affect the mission? How do you make sure that the relationship to the popular mobilization forces, which have been integrated in the regular Iraqi standing forces, will not be beneficiaries of this training mission? Or are there provisions taken to that end? It's I believe, a very difficult issue considering the relation of the PMF with Iran. Second question, what do you expect to come out of the NATO-Russia Council meeting that I'm very happy you have called? And on a broader level, do you find this a useful format, 1 versus 29? Sometimes one hears that for the Russian side it's a bit difficult. So I'd like to hear your view on that.
Boris Rezhnevsky from Canada, please.
Thank you. Secretary General, I'd just like to use this opportunity to restate that Canada unequivocally supports Ukraine's and Georgia's North Atlantic integration. And I'd like to thank you for acknowledging Canada's increasing role in Europe, although we find ourselves on the other side of the Atlantic. We understand that NATO's greatest military challenge these days is on its eastern front, a hard military front line that stretches from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In that context, Canada, as everyone is aware of here, has our mission in Latvia. We're involved in Romania with air defense. And although not a NATO mission per se, since December of 2014, along with our British and American allies, we've been involved in Operation Unifier to train Ukrainian soldiers. We've trained over 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers and officers. And would you consider encouraging our allied members to take part in this Operation Unifier, as it's proven to be invaluable on that part of the Eastern Front?
Thank you so much. First to Richard Bennion, cyber. Well, I agree with you that in one way it's comparable with Air Force, because for many years battles were only fought, wars were only fought or conducted, or fighting was only taking place either on land or at sea. And then we started to develop air forces, and then that was a new domain. And now we are confronted with a totally new domain, cyberspace. And what we have decided, and we are now in the process of implementing that, is to then establish cyber as a military domain for NATO alongside air, sea and land. We have also decided, as you know, that a cyber attack can trigger Article 5, and that was actually a very big decision, because then we recognize that cyber attacks can be as damaging, as dangerous as a kinetic attack. Third, we are stepping up our efforts when it comes to protecting our own cyber networks, and we are doing more to exchange best practices, to learn from each other, not least by using the Center of Excellence in Tallinn on national cyber effects, and they share them or integrate them into NATO missions and operations. That's something we now have created a framework for doing, and I think that's extremely important also to have that kind of cyber capabilities available for the whole alliance. But this is an ongoing process because the cyber threats are constantly changing, so we have to constantly adapt our cyber posture. Then Mr. Lambsdorff's Iraq training efforts. First, NATO is doing some training in Iraq today, but what we are going to do is to, as you know, to establish a mission which then provides a much better platform, framework for scaling up training in Iraq. Second, I strongly believe that training is the key, because we have to make sure that we're not forced to come back in a combat operation and to be able to combat ISIS once again. So in one way or another, we have to build some local forces to enable them to keep ISIS or anything similar down and to prevent them from coming back. Third, we are only going to train Iraqi government forces, and of course there will be a vetting process, and well, of course we will only be there if we are wanted by the Iraqi government, but so far we have not got any indications that the elections will lead to any change in the Iraqi position, but we will only be there if we are invited, of course. The last thing I will say is that I think it will be a bit paradox. I visited Iraq several times, and I met with different politicians, and they all want NATO. And second, they don't distinguish that much between NATO and NATO allies, which I fully understand. So I think that it will be a paradox if, in a way, if NATO allies, which are both members of NATO and members of the US-led coalition, They say that training is okay if it's the US-led coalition that conducts the trainings, but training is not okay if it's NATO that conducts the training. For me, that's exactly the same, to be honest. It's NATO allies providing training for Iraqi forces, either in the US-led coalition, as a coalition to defeat ISIS framework, or in the NATO framework. Fundamentally, it is the same effort to enable the Iraqis to protect their own country. And therefore, I also think that if there are any problems, they are likely to be both for NATO training and for training in the coalition framework, but I hope that we can continue to do both. And of course, the coalition and NATO is working closely together because the main capabilities of the coalition is provided by NATO allies. So this is actually the same nations working together in different frameworks. Then a new question from Canada. Yeah, first of all, you are a very strong voice when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia. I know that I appreciate that very much. Thank you for your contributions to our enhanced foreign presence in Latvia, being a framework or lead nation there. And thank you also for what you do in Ukraine. And I think that when I say that NATO provides political and practical support to Ukraine, it's partly what we provide in the NATO framework, but also what NATO allies provide bilaterally. And to be honest, again, it's not that big difference for those who receive the aid, whether it's the NATO ally Canada or NATO allied Canada to a NATO framework providing help. The important thing is that we as a NATO family provide help to Ukraine. And Canada is really leading by example through all the help you provide. Thank you.
Okay, last 4 questions. I ask you to be telegraphic because we are running out of time. Anna Fotiga from the European Parliament, Madeleine Moon, Malahati Brengisi, and Christian Tibringhed. Anna Fotiga, please.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary General, thank you for this broad overview, in particular for stressing the importance of the transatlantic bond, both with the United States and Canada, that I also find crucial for successful EU-NATO cooperation. Please raise the issue of targeted killings, abductions of both Georgian and Ukrainian citizens while talking to Russia in close future. I hope that we'll find the format during NATO summer summit in Brussels to speak properly to both representatives of both countries. I would like to raise one specific question concerning the Georgia-NATO Joint Training Center that was created open Norwegian initiative visited recently by the Subcommittee on Security and Defense mission to Georgia. I think that we have to find the format to continue this extremely important initiative to make it permanent and bringing Georgia closer to NATO. Thank you.
Madeleine Moon.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I personally thank the Secretary General for his personal demonstration of resilience and adaptation in the light of the interference he was experiencing during his presentation. As a Parliamentary Assembly, we welcome the creation of the Strategic Direction Hub South to contact, consult and coordinate with partners to find solutions to the challenges, particularly of terrorism, trafficking and employment and crime. It would be helpful to have further clarification of its role and tasks, and perhaps, if appropriate, suggest adding responsibility for the assessment, development and use of NATO space assets and the threats they face. I wonder if you could provide some comments. Thank you.
Mrs. Brengisi from Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Your Excellency, in your statement, you mentioned about main items to be debated at the Brussels summit. One of the items is projecting stability. In this framework, what can you about defending your partners, including Azerbaijan, which is contributing to energy security to Europe, in fighting against separatism, extremism, terrorism, and the occupation of territory, which are taking place in South Caucasus? Thank you very much.
Christian Tybring-Gjedde from the head of the Norwegian delegation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Stoltenberg for an excellent speech. As I said before, we're very happy that you're in Brussels and not in Oslo. I will ask a question that could be viewed as somewhat controversial, but that's not my point. NATO is a political alliance and a military alliance, but it's first and foremost a military alliance. I worked at NATO in 1999 to 2001, and it was an increase in the number of nations from 13 to 16. Since that time, it has almost doubled the number of nations. And it's a steady rise of nations, so of course, steady rise of responsibilities and coordination and military activities and training and so on. Does the Secretary General see a limit to the numbers of members of NATO in order to be most fit to protect each other in times of crisis and war, or is just being a democratic state and having democratic institutions the only criteria to become a member of NATO? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First to Anna Fotyga from the European Parliament. Yeah. You asked me a specific question on Georgia and the NATO training center. Also, I have visited the NATO training center, and it shows that it's an excellent training center, not so far away from Tbilisi, and I was there when the training center was inaugurated, and it shows that we are working together. We provide support to Georgia with the training center, but also Georgia provides a lot of support to NATO missions and operations. So this goes both ways. It is extremely important that the training center continues, and I urge, therefore, when I travel around, NATO allies and partners to provide trainers. And I'm grateful for Norway that has played a key role in providing trainers to the center. But of course, we also need other allies. So you can go back to your parliaments and ask your governments to make sure that they send some trainers, not only to Afghanistan, we need them there, to Iraq, but also to Georgia and other countries. So we can make sure that we continue the training center in Georgia. Then Madeleine Moon, you asked me about space assets. Well, more and more allies are developing some space assets, but at the same time, it's very important that we, whatever we do, is fully in line with international law. This is also an area where, of course, not so many allies are able to operate, but some allies are working on and addressing the challenges we see in space, and also NATO has some work where we coordinate and address this as a NATO alliance. Then on Azerbaijan, well, Azerbaijan is a partner of NATO. We appreciate the partnership with Azerbaijan. President Aliyev recently visited NATO. He addressed the North Atlantic Council, and we are grateful for the cooperation with Azerbaijan. We are, of course, aware of the challenges and the conflict related to Nagorno-Karabakh, and we just support all efforts to find a peaceful and negotiated solution. It is for all sides to find a way towards a peaceful settlement in the framework of the co-chairs of the OSCE Minsk group, and NATO fully supports those efforts. Then to Christian Tybring-Gjedde. Well, I have been strongly in favor of the enlargement of NATO. And of course, I also strongly believe that the enlargement of NATO and the European Union since the fall of the Berlin Wall has contributed to stability, to peace and prosperity across Europe. So it has been a great historic success. The fact that we had leaders that actually showed the courage to formulate open door policy, and then enabling NATO to go from 16 members, as we were in 80, when the Berlin Wall came down, and then almost twice as many today, has been a great historic success. And Poland is an example of that. Having said that, of course, there are challenges. When you go from 16 to to 29, and perhaps even more. And I have a father that was a foreign minister in Norway in the, and defense minister and state secretary in the 70s and 80s. And he remembers when there were 12 members, only, and then there was only men sitting there smoking cigars and having some nice dinners. And that was, and some serious work. But that was very easy. Now we are 29, much bigger. And of course, we are an organization based on consensus. So it is sometimes, it goes without saying that decision-making becomes a bit more difficult when you are 29 than when you were 12. But therefore, we need to continue to reform, continue to, what should I say, be flexible and find solutions when there are disagreements. And we have been able to prove that with the big adaptation and all the big decisions we have been able to make in NATO over the last couple of years with many more members. Then you asked me whether there's a limit. Yes, there is a limit in a way, because you have to be a European country. And therefore, to become a member, there is actually 3 conditions. You need to meet the NATO standards when it comes to, your institutions, democracy, rule of law, individual liberty. Second, you need to be a European country. And most European countries are now members of NATO, so there are not that many potential more members. And thirdly, the membership has to contribute to transatlantic peace and security. So there are some aspirant countries, but the number of potential members are in no way as many as there were in the 1990s, where we really had a big increase that you witnessed when you worked in NATO, because then the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, and there were 8 members of the Warsaw Pact. 7 are now members of NATO, and also some of the former republics of the Soviet Union are now also NATO members, and that has been a great success. Thank you so much. The problem is not the length of the questions, the problem is the length of the answers.
No, you're excellent. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I think this was a great exchange of views, great question and answers. Thank you for them. So now we have to switch to the next point on the agenda, the debate and vote of the draft declaration. As I accompany outside Secretary General, I ask Raja Yevgenievich to take the chair. Thank you.